Prologue, 15th of August 1969, Bombay Street, Belfast, Northern Ireland. Maeve wanted to scream. Instead, she forced herself to make no sound. Determined not to reveal her whereabouts, she bit her lip and crouched back against the wall of her hiding place. She could hear the roaring mob outside on the street, and she tried to make herself even smaller as she hid in the dark cupboard space under the living room stairs, praying that they wouldn't find her. The trouble that had been brewing in Belfast for months had finally erupted, and now people from neighbouring districts were violently attacking each other. The air was rent with gunfire, screams, the smashing of glass, and the roar of flames as house after house was set on fire. Maeve knew from the news on the radio that much of the city had turned into a war zone. It meant that she couldn't count on the police to rescue her, and so she was trapped here alone, with no one to help her. Even though she was more frightened than she'd ever been in her life, she was angry too. Why did people have to be so horrible and cruel to each other? Maeve had been living with her aunt and uncle in Belfast for 3 years now, but she still found it hard to understand why so many Catholics and Protestants hated each other. Her Uncle Jim said Catholic nationalists like themselves were a minority in Northern Ireland, where most people were Protestant loyalists who wanted to stay in the United Kingdom. Uncle Jim said nationalists mostly wanted a united Ireland, though in the meantime lots of them would settle for a fair deal on decent jobs and houses. But it was one thing for Uncle Jim to explain how people felt, another to deal with the hatred that had erupted in the last 2 days. And just when she needed him most, her uncle was away working in Donegal. Aunt Nan hadn't been able to get home either, and was now trapped in the Ardoyne district, a small nationalist area that was also under siege. Aunt Nan had gone there to visit a sick friend, only to find herself unable to get safely out again. She'd sent a message to Maeve via a neighbour who had a telephone, and had insisted that Maeve was to lock the door and stay put, and under no circumstances to go out into Bombay Street. As if I'd want to, Maeve had thought irritably. Being 12 years old, she found it annoying when her aunts treated her like a baby, though just now she would have happily curled up in the comfort of Aunt Nan's arms. Thinking of her aunt, Maeve began to feel tearful. No, she told herself, getting weepy wasn't going to solve anything. She had to keep her wits about her and fend for herself. The gunfire and noise from the street were getting louder, and Maeve was glad that she'd resisted the temptation to make a run for the nearby Clonard Monastery. It was a big building in its own grounds, and its basement had been used as a community air raid shelter during the Second World War. But the mob swarming through the streets was so crazed now that Maeve feared they wouldn't see the Catholic monastery as a refuge to be respected, but might well see it as a target. Suddenly there was a loud thud from nearby, and Maeve started in shock. The sound came again, and she realised that somebody was pounding on the front door. Oh God, she thought, please let the lock hold. The banging got louder, and Maeve bit her lip again. There was more banging, then a splintering sound, followed by the whole door being smashed against the wall. Maeve felt her heart pounding madly. She prayed that whoever had broken in wouldn't think of looking into the small dark storage space under the stairs. She held her breath as several people came clattering into the living room. There was loud laughter and whooping as the rioters violently overturned tables and chairs and smashed ornaments in the living room and adjoining kitchenette. Maeve felt sickened at the destruction, knowing how house-proud Aunt Nan was. Even as she thought it, however, part of her brain realised that none of that really mattered. Tables and chairs could be replaced, but if they found her hiding place, there was no telling what might happen. Before she could worry any further, she heard a harsh, drunken voice. It was startlingly close, just on the other side of the wooden door that separated under the stairs from the living room, and the man's words were horrifying. "Take that can and douse upstairs, Davy. We'll do here." Maeve felt a stab of panic, even though she'd known that the house might be set on fire. "My pleasure," answered the man, with a drunken laugh. "My pleasure." "And don't skimp with the petrol, Davy," the first man cried, laughing as though it were all a great joke. "We don't want the Taigs saying we shortchanged them." Maeve heard the man call Davy pounding up the stairs that ran over her head. Then the rioters in the front room gave another whoop of triumph. Maeve realised they'd found the money that Aunt Nan kept in a small tin on the mantelpiece. She'd heard them arguing over how to split it, and she willed them to continue their drunken dispute, hoping it would distract them from opening the door to her hiding place. She heard more footsteps as someone else entered the room. The new man spoke. His voice was cold and hard, and somehow more frightening for not sounding drunk like the others. "Any Taigs here?" he said. Taigs was an insulting word for nationalists or Catholics, and Maeve felt her legs trembling at the thought of this man finding her. She wrapped her hands around her knees to keep them still. "Not down here," answered the first rider. "Davy's checking upstairs." There was a pause, and Maeve imagined the new arrival, noticing the door under the stairs and yanking it open. She held her breath, desperately anxious to do nothing to alert him to her presence. "OK, torch the place," said the man. Maeve felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself not to panic. She'd read an adventure story in which the heroine survived the fire by using buckets of water and a wet blanket to protect herself. Copying the girl from the story, Maeve had filled several buckets of water earlier and had taken a blanket off her bed. Her hope was that even if the house was set on fire, the stone walls wouldn't collapse. If she could protect herself long enough with the wet blanket, the rioters might pass through her neighbourhood, allowing her to emerge eventually. It was a frightening plan, but before she could think about it any more, she heard a shout from the front room. "Let's go, Davy!" There was a sudden whoosh as the petrol-doused room was set ablaze. Maeve cowered against the back wall, feeling the heat through the thin partition that separated her from the burning room. The man called Davy must have set the bedrooms alight as well, because there was another whoosh of flames from above. Then the man shrieked with delight and pounded down the stairs. "That will warm their hearts," cried the first drunken rioter, kicking a chair against the wall in farewell as he made his way towards the front door. Maeve felt a flood of relief that the men had left without finding her. The relief didn't last for long though. The rioters had left her house, but there was still mayhem outside. And in here the blaze was taking hold. Maeve could feel the heat coming down from the upper floor, and she quickly soaked the blanket in the fire bucket of water, then wrapped it around herself. The cold wet blanket felt horrible against her skin, but it could save her life, and she wet herself thoroughly, trying to ignore the terrifying crackle of the fire from the living room. Smoke was now coming in through the cracks in the cupboard door, and Maeve coughed, then pulled the wet blanket around her mouth and nose. She'd originally thought the rioters would only use petrol bombs to damage the house. She realised now that in dousing the individual rooms with petrol, they'd started a more serious fire. And if it continued spreading, the wooden partition wall between under the stairs and the living room would eventually go up in flames, exposing her to the full blast of the fire. But if she tried to make a run for it, she risked not only the flames, but also discovery by the rioters, to say nothing of the shooting and fighting going on outside. Moving forward in the darkened space, she splashed water from the second bucket onto the inside of the cupboard wall. The smoke was getting worse now, and she found herself coughing again. Despite being trapped in the wet blanket, it was getting uncomfortably hot. She got another fit of coughing and began to wonder if she wasn't making a terrible mistake. Supposing the fire didn't burn itself out? Supposing it spread and burnt everything in the house to a cinder? She could hear the sounds of the two upstairs bedrooms blazing now, and she was racked with indecision. Stay and hope to escape the rioters, but maybe get burnt alive? Or risk running through the blazing room and taking her chances out on the battlefield that was her neighbourhood? She hesitated, wishing there was someone to help her. Pray to Our Lady for guidance, and Nan always said, and in desperation Maeve now prayed for help. No sooner had she finished the quick prayer, however, and she got another, worse bout of coughing from the thickening smoke. The rasping coughing hurt her lungs, and it didn't seem like her prayer had been answered. But maybe it had, she thought. Maybe this was a signal that she shouldn't stay here. Still she hesitated, terrified to face the blaze. But the darkened cupboard became hotter and brighter as tongues of flame began to lick the door and the outer wall. She couldn't stay here. She was going to die unless she got up the nerve to brave both the flames and the battle outside. Her mind suddenly made up. She doused the blanket again with water. She wrapped it round herself, then took the second pail and upended it over her head so that she was soaked. She paused briefly, getting her nerve up. Then she steeled herself, drew the blanket up over her head, and pulled open the door to the blazing living room.